So the first thing I'm here to say, despite the high likelihood that you found this video because of my DIY CO2 videos, is that I have made the switch to a... Okay, so you've decided you're going to start using CO2 in your aquarium to achieve amazing plant growth. You did a quick Google, tons of different systems came up at various price points and difficulty levels, and now you're here, hoping I can help explain what it's all about. There are so many different types of CO2 systems out there, and by and large they all have their place. But what the manufacturers are not great at telling you is for what purpose each system is best for and how to avoid any false economies. So that's why I'm here, to break it all down for you. In this video, we'll cover the best CO2 system for nano tanks, at what stage it makes sense to upgrade to larger CO2 systems, and what the real-life pros, cons, and cost efficiencies are for each system. We'll cover disposable CO2 cans, yeast and sugar setups, soda bottle and steel canister kits with bicarb and citric acid, disposable pressurized CO2 systems, and finally, refillable CO2 canisters with a regulator. I'll also have a few bonus tips at the end for those of you that stick around, and equally, if you're in a rush, I'll leave chapter markers for each individual method so that you can skip to a particular CO2 system if you want. So let's get down to it. First up, disposable CO2 cans. Now these are probably the most common entry point to CO2 for planted aquariums. You get a CO2 can that looks a little bit like a bulkier can of deodorant, which you attach to some airline hose and manually fill up a plastic chamber which attaches to the glass of your tank. Here in the UK, a free pack of cans is going to cost around £20, and one can would dose a 60-litre aquarium for a month and a 20-litre aquarium for 2 months. Whilst this might not sound like an horrendous expense, compared with the economies of other methods on this list, it's really not all that great. As you can probably tell, these CO2 cans are designed for nano aquariums, and they do a perfectly adequate job of providing a small amount of CO2 to the aquarium, which will help improve the health of beginner level plants. However, where these systems are let down is by the chamber they use for diffusion of CO2 into the aquarium. Basically, this chamber relies on a very slow and passive method of CO2 diffusing into the water as it's passed under the chamber. This can be improved slightly by increasing flow under the chamber, but ultimately these systems are just very inefficient compared to the other options on the list. Equally, this is very much a manual method, relying on you to refill the chamber every day, and there is no way of automating with a solenoid valve. So are CO2 cans beginner friendly? Yes, you can't get much simpler in terms of usability. Are they affordable? Not in the grand scheme of things. Would you use this on a larger aquarium? No. And would it significantly boost plant growth? Not really. For me, these systems have their place as a solid entry point for people who are a little daunted by large pressurized systems. But once you see the benefits of other things on this list, I don't think you'll be rushing out to buy one. So it's a 2 out of 10 for me. Next on the list is the yeast and sugar method for generating CO2. Now you can very easily make your own DIY versions, or there are a bunch of commercially available options too. Personally, this is such a simple method that I would recommend the DIY route. And more specifically, I'd point you in the direction of Mark from MJ Aquascaping, who has a great tutorial video exploring this method and how he uses gelatin to make a longer lasting reaction. I'll leave a link in the description. But in brief, the yeast and sugar method relies on reacting the two ingredients so they produce CO2 and then diffusing this into your aquarium via a glass diffuser. The biggest downside to this method is that you can't switch it off at night, and this increases the risk of suffocating your fish by limiting their ability to get oxygen. Equally, this method is not easy to regulate. The only way to increase or decrease the amount of CO2 is by adjusting the amount of raw ingredients. Finally, this reaction can take up to 24 hours to get started, so it's far from an immediate solution. On the plus side, this is a very cheap solution, probably the cheapest in fact, as yeast and sugar are easily available from your local supermarket, and a little will go a long way. I'd estimate you'll get an 8 to 10 week supply in a 30-litre tank for just a couple of pounds, and ultimately the end result is comparable to other DIY solutions on the list. So is the yeast and sugar method beginner friendly? Sort of. The DIY method is not overly complicated, but I can see why this would be a bit daunting for some people at the beginning of their fish keeping journey. Is the method affordable? Absolutely. In fact, it is probably the cheapest on the list. Would you use this on a larger aquarium? Well, you can, but as with most of the DIY options, it boils down to how often you want to be refilling the ingredients. So ultimately, this is still more suitable for nano aquariums. And would it significantly boost plant growth? Yes, it certainly can, but you're going to have to play about with the ingredients to get the right CO2 concentration. For me, this method is only let down by the inability to control the amount of CO2 and switch off the system at night. So, whilst it's a very affordable system for Nano Tanks, it's only a 4 out of 10 for me. Next up, DIY soda bottle kits. Many of you might have found this channel after watching a rather long-winded and rambling tutorial by me a couple of years ago. These kits enable you to turn 2 soda bottles into a CO2 generator. You make up a solution of citric acid and water in one bottle and bicarbonate of soda and water in the other bottle. The kit consists of a regulator valve and a series of piping that goes between the 2 bottles via some bottle caps that will fit most plastic bottles that you'll find in the supermarket for water or fizzy drinks. You pressurize the system via squeezing citric acid into the bicarb bottle and the 2 react to create CO2. The main difference from the yeast and sugar method is that the reaction is cleverly controlled via a siphon between the 2 bottles, so the reaction is slow and steady, and can also be stopped entirely via lifting the pipe out of the citric acid with a small magnet. What this means is that you can shut the system off at night. In fact, when I was using this system, I even attached a solenoid valve so that I could automatically shut it off via a smart plug. The pressure the system achieves also means you can adjust the flow rate much like more professional systems. The main downside of these kits is there's no filtration of the CO2. Whilst I have never noticed any issues, there is evidence that impurities from the reaction can be imparted into the tank if you don't filter the CO2 via some form of water or sponge filter like you'll see in the next system on the list. Similar to the yeast and sugar method, the soda bottle kits can be used on any size tank, but the limiting factor is how frequently you're prepared to refill and restart the reaction. On that basis, it is more suited to nano aquariums up to 30 litres, and you can comfortably get a 4 to 6 week supply from one reaction. The raw ingredients are also pretty cheap. Recently I've been purchasing 1 kilogram of citric acid for about £8 and 1 kilogram of bicarb for about £5. So every reaction with 200 grams of each ingredient is costing around £2.60. So are DIY soda bottle kits beginner friendly? Definitely. The kits are pretty self-explanatory and it's hard to get anything wrong. Just be careful to fully seal the bottle lids. Is the method affordable? Very much so. The initial kit costs around £20 and then ingredients are pretty cheap as discussed. Would you use this on a larger aquarium? Not really. And would it significantly boost plant growth? Definitely, although there is still that slight concern about impurities getting into the tank. For me, there are very few downsides to this method other than the regular refills and lack of a filter. For nano tank usage, this is a 5 out of 10 for me. Now on to steel CO2 generator cylinders, which once again are very highly likely to be the reason you found this channel. For in-depth advice on these systems, my video and the great community that has built up in the comments section is a great place to start learning. I'll of course leave links to this video and my top tips video in the description. But in short, the CO2 generator is another way of containing the reaction of citric acid and bicarbonate of soda to create a pressurized source of CO2 for your aquarium. With this method, you simply dump all the ingredients together and the steel canister is rated to withstand the pressure of the full reaction. There are now models available with a solenoid valve built in, or you can connect your own. Also, as mentioned, these generators have a filter built into the lid which stops any impurities from entering your aquarium. Once again, the limiting factor is how frequently you're prepared to refill and restart the reaction. I know from previous research and the help of Reddit that 200 grams of citric acid and 200 grams of bicarbonate of soda react to create 105 grams of CO2. Now this is actually slightly more CO2 than the next system on my list, which manufacturers claim is adequate for a 190 litre aquarium. However, I would in no way recommend the CO2 generator for larger aquariums. I used this system very successfully in a 55 litre tank, but still only got an average of 33 days use from a single reaction. I would say 50 to 60 litres is the maximum tank capacity you're going to want to use the system on, and it's best suited to nano aquariums up to 30 litres, where you can expect to get 4 to 6 weeks of CO2. The ingredients cost is identical to the soda bottle system, so currently around £2.60 per refill, but the major drawback of this system is the initial cost of the cylinder. Now I bought mine a few years ago and it was pretty affordable back then at around £40, but recently they have almost doubled in price. An initial outlay of £80 really starts to put you into professional pressurized CO2 territory, but the one thing this generator still has going for it is you can refill easily at home rather than having to find a local CO2 supplier, pay a hefty deposit, and often a bottle rental fee. So I do think these systems still have their place, especially for nano tanks where a huge CO2 bottle would be pretty hard to hide away. So are steel CO2 generator cylinders beginner friendly? Absolutely. Of all the DIY solutions, I'd say this is by far and away the simplest. Is the method affordable? Well, it's not quite as good value as the yeast and sugar method, but it's still very cheap and certainly more affordable than the disposable cylinders that we'll talk about next. Would you use this on a larger aquarium? No, it's really only good for 60 litres or less. And would it significantly boost plant growth? Yes, absolutely. Personally, I think this is the best option for someone wanting to dose CO2 in one single nano tank safely and relatively affordably. But if you have multiple nano tanks or a large aquarium, then stay tuned for the last system on my list. But for nano tank usage, this system is a 7 out of 10 for me. Right, now on to disposable pressurized CO2 kits. There are plenty of options out there from many manufacturers, all doing roughly the same thing. You'll buy a starter kit for around £80 to £120, and thereafter you'll purchase the disposable replacements for about £20 for somewhere in the region of 95 grams of CO2. A notable outlier in this category is that Denali have started making a system that supports 425 gram Sodastream cylinders, which generally cost around £20 also, and do at least operate on a deposit and recycling scheme. So if you're going to look at these type of kits, then this option will be the one to look at in my opinion. But it's still significantly more expensive than refillable CO2 canisters that we'll talk about next. However, like I said, the main issue with these kits is the disposable nature of the cylinders and the huge price point for a relatively small amount of CO2. The claims that a 95 gram cylinder will be sufficient for a 190 litre aquarium just seem farcical to me. Based on the performance of my 105 gram DIY canister above, we can estimate that a 95 gram cylinder would last between 1 to 2 weeks on a heavily planted 190 litre aquarium. I simply do not know how the manufacturers are able to make these recommendations. Also, the impact on the environment of disposable cylinders is terrible, and ultimately you're going to have times when you aren't running CO2 in your aquarium because you don't have time to rush out and buy a replacement all the time. In my opinion, these systems are actually worse than all of the other DIY systems on the list. The only potential pro I can think of is that these cylinders do at least contain food-grade CO2, so you can be sure that you are dosing the best quality CO2 available as opposed to the potential impurities in the DIY solutions we've already talked about. So are disposable pressurized CO2 kits beginner friendly? Yes, I suppose they are. They're nice and easy to set up, but you'll need to pop back to the fish shop fairly regularly for a replacement. Is the method affordable? Absolutely not. As discussed, this is a classic economy of consumable parts and presents zero value for money to the consumer and a huge profit to the manufacturer. Would you use this on a larger aquarium? No. Even if the manufacturer says differently, this is definitely for nano tank use only. And would it significantly boost plant growth? Yes, so long as you're able to keep up with a constant resupply. So as you can probably tell, I think these are systems to steer clear of. If you absolutely cannot find any other solution and aren't prepared to try the DIY route, then at least consider the slightly more affordable Denali solution. But ultimately, I think all of these systems are a massive rip-off. They do, however, perform better than disposable CO2 cans we spoke about first, so on that basis, these are a 3 out of 10 for me. So finally, we need to talk about refillable CO2 canisters with a regulator. I think the main stumbling block here is accessibility. It seems complicated, and for a lot of people, myself included, it can take a long time to work up the confidence to enter into the world of full-scale CO2 cylinders with a proper professional level regulator and solenoid. So the first thing I'm here to say, despite the high likelihood that you found this video because of my DIY CO2 videos, is that I have made the switch to a 6 kg refillable CO2 cylinder with a single stage regulator. Why? Well, because as soon as you start to consider dosing more than one nano tank with CO2, or any larger aquarium for that matter, the economics of DIY solutions begin to disintegrate. For £24, I can refill a 6 kg cylinder that will dose all 5 of my aquariums for over 6 months. By contrast, to make 6 kilograms of CO2 with citric acid and bicarb would require 148 pounds worth of ingredients. All of this is not to say that DIY CO2 doesn't have its place, it's just to illustrate that it is not economical at scale. And as for disposable CO2 cylinders, at £20 for 95 grams, you are talking an eye-watering £1,260 for 6 kilograms of CO2. Daylight robbery. Now, the obvious con for professional CO2 systems is the initial setup costs. I had to pay a £75 deposit for the cylinder. I'm locked into a £1.50 monthly rental fee that gets added to my bill each time I refill the cylinder, and I had to buy the regulator for £100. Oh, and in my specific case, where I'm using one cylinder on multiple tanks, I also had to buy a 6-way splitter for £50. And even after all of that, it still works out cheaper in the long run. Basically, my new setup makes its money back compared to disposable cylinders after just 6 weeks. And it makes its money back compared to DIY CO2 generators after 6 months. On top of all that, you know that you can safely run a solenoid and that the food grade CO2 is definitely safe for your fish. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about setting up refillable CO2 systems in this video. That's really a topic for another day. But I hope it's clear that if you can overcome the accessibility barrier with professional level CO2 systems, you will ultimately save yourself a lot of cash. So are refillable CO2 systems beginner friendly? Not as much as other things on the list, but I promise it isn't as daunting as it sounds. Is the method affordable? After the initial fairly hefty setup costs, this method quickly becomes the most affordable on the list. Would you use this on a larger aquarium? Yes, absolutely. In fact, this is the only method I would recommend for a larger aquarium, or indeed for multiple aquariums with a CO2 splitter. And would it significantly boost plant growth? Yes, absolutely. So with all of those considerations, it's a 9 out of 10 for me. So with all of that out of the way, I hope it's clear that I have 2 recommendations. If you are just keeping one single nano tank, then based on quality and affordability, the best system for your purposes is a DIY steel CO2 generator. If, however, you have multiple nano tanks or any tank larger than around 60 litres, then really and truly the only avenue, again based on quality and affordability, is to invest in a professional CO2 system with a refillable cylinder from a local supplier. Now, I'll certainly be doing some follow-up videos to share my experience of switching to this system in the near future, so stay tuned for that. And in the meantime, feel free to ask any questions in the comment section below. And now those bonus tips that I promised earlier. All of these efficiency calculations wouldn't have been possible without a good, reliable bubbles per second calculator to work out how long each cylinder was going to last. When embarking on Aquarium CO2 for the first time, this was the #1 confusion for me too. So I'd recommend that you get a personal benchmark for your tanks with which to start your dosing by using the online calculator at aquariuminfo.org. This will give you a good starting point, but do not stop there. You also need to get a drop checker and indicator fluid, and always aim for a lime green drop checker. Start with the online calculation and gently adjust up or down accordingly until you have a safe CO2 reading for your tank. And a final non-aquarium related bonus tip, and slightly related to the Sodastream CO2 efficiency that I was talking about earlier. If you follow my advice and build up the confidence to purchase food grade CO2 from a local supplier, I would also highly recommend hacking your Sodastream with a simple adapter and getting a ridiculously cheap source of fizzy water as well. That's if you're a connoisseur of sparkling water, of course. So there you go. I'll leave links for everything we've spoken about in the description, and I really hope this was a useful buyer's guide and explanation of the somewhat confusing world of Aquarium CO2. If you have now decided that a CO2 generator is the best option for you, check out my tutorial video on the top card, and for my latest video, check out the bottom card. Take care, and I'll see you soon.